There's nothing more heartbreaking than watching a father try to feed his children when there's nothing left to give. In a world where pride means everything, sometimes desperation forces good men to their knees. In the Colorado mountains of 1882, Daniel Price arrives at Sylvie Garner's cabin with 3 hungry children and makes a simple offer. He'll build her a new cabin in exchange for food to keep his family alive through winter. Sylvie has lived alone in these mountains for 15 years, trusting no one. But when she looks into the eyes of those starving children, she agrees to the bargain. What she doesn't know is that Daniel didn't find her by accident. He came looking for her, carrying secrets about her past that could change everything. Why would a desperate man with hungry mouths to feed risk his family's survival to find one woman hidden deep in the wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and impending snow as Sylvie Garner stepped from her supply wagon onto the familiar ground outside her cabin. She had built this life with her own hands. Every log chinked with moss and clay, every shingle cut from timber she'd felled herself. The cabin sat in a natural clearing where the morning sun could reach through the towering pines, warming the south-facing wall where she'd planted a small garden each spring for 15 years. Her boots crunched on the frost-covered ground as she unhitched the mules, their breath forming white clouds in the crisp October air. The supply run to Millerville had taken 3 days longer than expected, delayed by an early storm that had dumped 6 inches of snow on the high passes. She'd traded her carefully preserved summer vegetables and hand-woven blankets for winter provisions, salt pork, flour, coffee beans that cost more than most folks earned in a week, and precious ammunition for her father's old hunting rifle. Sylvie had learned long ago that survival in these mountains demanded respect for every season's gifts and warnings. She read the sky like scripture, knew which birds disappeared before heavy weather, and could tell by the way smoke rose from her chimney whether the next day would bring sun or storm. At 38, her hands were as steady with an axe as they were with a sewing needle, her shoulders broad from years of splitting wood and hauling water from the creek that wound through the valley below. The sound of a child's cough stopped her cold. She turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving to the knife at her belt. In all her years of mountain living, unexpected visitors meant trouble more often than not. Trappers occasionally passed through, and twice she'd encountered prospectors following rumors of silver veins. But children never appeared on her mountainside. That's when she saw them. A man knelt in the muddy ground beside her cabin, his broad shoulders hunched forward in a posture of complete exhaustion. 3 small figures huddled against him, 2 children and what appeared to be a baby wrapped in a threadbare blanket. The man's dark hair fell across his forehead as he looked up at her approach, and she saw eyes the color of storm clouds, rimmed with the kind of weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with fatigue, "I'm Daniel Price. These are my children, Emma, Thomas, and little Lucy." He gestured to each child in turn. The oldest, a girl with tangled brown hair and serious eyes, couldn't have been more than 8. The boy beside her, perhaps 6, pressed his face against his father's shoulder as if trying to disappear. The baby in the man's arms stirred restlessly, making soft whimpering sounds. Sylvie studied them carefully. The children's clothes were clean but patched, their shoes worn thin at the soles. The man's hands, she noticed, bore the calluses and small scars of someone who worked with tools, a craftsman of some kind. An axe lay beside him in the mud, its handle smooth from years of use, and a leather satchel sat nearby, bulging with what she assumed were his tools. "We've been traveling for weeks," Daniel continued, shifting the baby to a more comfortable position. "I heard in town that someone said you lived up here alone and might be willing to make a trade." "What kind of trade?" Sylvie kept her voice even, though her mind raced. Few people in Millerville even knew she existed. and fewer still would direct strangers to her remote cabin. Daniel straightened slightly, and she could see him gathering what remained of his strength and pride. "I'm a carpenter, ma'am. A good one. I can build you whatever you need. Repair work, new construction, furniture. I've got my own tools and 15 years of experience. In exchange, I'm asking for food for my children and a place to shelter until I finish the work." The little girl, Emma, stepped forward then, her chin raised in a gesture that reminded Sylvie painfully of herself at that age. "Papa built the finest houses in Iowa before Mama died," she said with fierce loyalty. "He can build anything." Sylvie felt something twist in her chest at the child's words. The boy, Thomas, remained silent, but his large eyes never left her face, watching her with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. The baby had stopped fussing and now gazed at Sylvie with the unfocused attention of the very young. "When did you last eat?" she asked, though she could see the answer in the hollow of the children's cheeks, in the way they leaned against their father for warmth and comfort. "2 days ago," Daniel admitted. "We had some hardtack, but—" "Come inside," Sylvie said, surprising herself with the quickness of her decision. "All of you." She opened the cabin door and stepped back to let them pass. The interior was simple but comfortable. One large room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table she'd built herself, shelves lined with preserves and dried goods, and a sleeping loft accessible by a wooden ladder. The children's eyes went immediately to the pot hanging over the fire, where she'd left a stew simmering before her supply run. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing toward the table. "You too," she added when Daniel hesitated, still holding the baby. As they settled themselves, Sylvie moved with practiced efficiency around her kitchen area. She ladled generous portions of venison stew into wooden bowls, cut thick slices of the bread she'd traded for in town, and poured fresh milk from the cow she kept in a small barn behind the cabin. The children watched every movement with barely contained hunger. "Go ahead," she said. Setting the food before them, Emma picked up her spoon with careful politeness. But Thomas dove into his bowl with the desperation of genuine starvation. Even the baby, seated on her father's lap, eagerly accepted spoonfuls of the rich broth. Daniel ate more slowly, but Sylvie noticed how his shoulders relaxed with each bite, how some of the tension left his weathered face. "This is good," Emma said softly. "Thank you, ma'am." "Miss Garner," Sylvie corrected. "And you're welcome." As they ate, she studied Daniel Price more carefully. He was perhaps her age or a few years older, with the lean build of a man accustomed to physical work. His clothes, like his children's, showed signs of hard traveling but were well made and carefully maintained. Most telling were his hands, long-fingered and precise, marked by the specific calluses that came from years of handling wood and tools. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Iowa, originally," Daniel replied, giving Lucy another spoonful of stew. "We were farming outside of Cedar Rapids until my wife passed last spring. Tried to keep going, but—" He glanced at his children, choosing his words carefully. "Times got hard. Lost the farm to debts. So you decided to head west. Seemed like the only choice. Heard there was work in Colorado. Maybe a chance to start over." His voice held the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned to keep his troubles to himself. Sylvie nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. She'd made her own desperate journey west 15 years ago, though under very different circumstances. The mountains had given her what she'd needed then: solitude, safety, and the chance to build a life entirely her own. "What kind of work are you looking for?" she asked. "Anything honest," Daniel said. "But I'm best with wood. Framing, finish work, furniture making. I can read plans or work from my own designs." He paused, then added quietly, "I know this is a lot to ask, ma'am, taking in strangers, especially with winter coming, but I can make it worth your while. I noticed your cabin could use some reinforcement for the heavy snows, maybe some weatherproofing. I could build you a better foundation, reinforce the roof structure." "The foundation's been fine for 15 years, Sylvie interrupted, though not unkindly. "Yes, ma'am, but with the right work, it could be fine for 50 more. She looked around her cabin with new eyes, seeing it as he might. The logs were sound but showing their age. The chinking needed repair in several places, and she'd been meaning to replace some of the window frames before winter set in properly. The thought of having skilled help with these tasks was admittedly tempting. More than that, though, she found herself moved by something in Daniel's bearing, the way he held himself with dignity despite his desperate circumstances, the obvious love and care he showed his children, the respectful way he spoke to her without any presumption or demand. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "But first, your children need rest. There's room in the loft, it's warm up there, and I have extra blankets." "We can't," Daniel began. "Yes, you can," Sylvie said firmly. "One night won't hurt anything. We can talk more tomorrow about any work arrangement." Emma looked up from her now empty bowl, her serious young face brightening for the first time since they'd arrived. "Really? We can stay inside tonight?" The question hit Sylvie harder than she'd expected. How many nights had these children spent sleeping rough, exposed to cold and weather? "Really?" she confirmed, as Daniel gathered his children and their few belongings to settle them in the loft. Sylvie found herself wondering what forces had brought this small family to her isolated doorstep. In 15 years, she'd grown accustomed to her solitude, to making decisions based solely on her own needs and safety. The presence of others in her carefully ordered space felt both intrusive and oddly comforting. She listened to the soft sounds of children settling into sleep above her head and realized that whatever decision she made tomorrow would change something fundamental about her mountain life. The only question was whether she was ready for that change, and whether Daniel Price was truly the honest man he appeared to be. Morning came early in the mountains, and Sylvie woke to the sound of voices outside her cabin. She dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch to find Daniel already at work, his children watching as he examined the foundation stones of her cabin with the focused attention of a craftsman assessing a project. "Found some settling on the north side," he called to her, running his hands along the base of the wall. "Nothing dangerous, but it's letting cold air underneath. I could shore that up today if you have some stones nearby." Emma sat on a fallen log, braiding grass stems with careful concentration while keeping an eye on little Lucy, who played happily with pine cones near her feet. Thomas stood close to his father, handing him tools from the leather satchel with the practiced ease of a boy who'd served as helper many times before. "There's a stone pile behind the barn," Sylvie said, "left over from when I built the place." She'd spent 2 years collecting and placing those foundation stones, learning through trial and error how to create a stable base that would withstand the mountain's freeze-thaw cycles. Watching Daniel work, she could see immediately that his experience far exceeded her own hard-won knowledge. His movements were efficient and purposeful as he lifted stones, tested their fit, and began repositioning them with small adjustments that somehow created a noticeably more solid foundation. The children chatted quietly among themselves, their voices carrying a lightness that had been absent the evening before. "Papa," Emma said, "when we have our own house again, can it have windows as big as Miss Garner's?" "We'll see, sweetheart," Daniel replied, not pausing in his work. "Good windows cost money, but you could make them, couldn't you? You made the beautiful cabinets for Mrs. Henderson back home." Sylvie noticed the slight tightening around Daniel's eyes at the mention of their old life. She busied herself preparing breakfast, but found herself listening to the family's easy conversation as she worked. There was love here and trust, but also the careful way they spoke about the future, as if making plans required a kind of faith none of them quite possessed yet. When she called them in for breakfast, the children came eagerly, but Daniel lingered outside, washing his hands in the cold water from her well. Through the window, she watched him pause and look out over the valley below, his expression thoughtful and somehow measuring. "This is beautiful country," he said when he finally joined them at the table. "Remote but beautiful. You must feel very safe up here." Something in his tone made Sylvie look at him more carefully. "Safe enough," she said. "I imagine not many people even know you're here. Must be nice, having that kind of privacy." There it was again, that subtle, probing quality to his words. Sylvie felt a familiar wariness creep up her spine, the same instinct that had kept her alive and hidden for 15 years. "How exactly did you hear about me in town?" she asked directly. Daniel paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "Bartender at the Silver Dollar mentioned you when I asked about work in the area. Said there was a woman up in the mountains who might need some repairs done." "Which bartender?" "Fellow with grey whiskers." "Didn't catch his name." Sylvie knew every person who worked at the Silver Dollar, and none of them had grey whiskers. More concerning, she'd made it clear to the few townspeople who knew of her existence that she valued her privacy above all else. The idea that a stranger could simply ask about her and receive directions to her cabin set off every alarm she'd learned to trust. "Papa," Thomas said suddenly, "show Miss Garner the picture of Mama." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Maybe later, son. But you said—" "I said later." The sharpness in his voice made Thomas shrink back, and Emma quickly distracted her little brother by pointing out a squirrel visible through the window. But Sylvie had caught the exchange, and more importantly, she'd seen the flash of something fear, that crossed Daniel's face. After breakfast, she watched from her kitchen window as Daniel resumed work on the foundation. His skill was undeniable. Already the north wall felt more solid than it had in years. But she noticed other things too. The way his eyes swept the property boundaries. How he seemed to be memorizing the layout of her land, the path down to the valley, the location of her barn and storage areas. When the children wandered off to explore the creek, Sylvie stepped outside to confront him directly. "Mr. Price," she said, "I think you and I need to have an honest conversation." Daniel straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. "Yes, ma'am?" "Who really sent you here?" For a long moment he didn't answer. His storm-grey eyes met hers, and she saw him making some kind of internal calculation. Finally he sighed heavily. "I can't tell you that." "Not yet. Can't or won't. Both, I suppose." He set down his tools and faced her fully. "Miss Garner, I swear to you that I mean you no harm. Neither do my children. We're exactly who we appear to be, a father trying to provide for his family. But that's not all you are." "No," he admitted quietly. "That's not all." The honesty in his voice surprised her, even as it confirmed her suspicions. "Then why should I let you stay?" Daniel looked toward the sound of his children's laughter echoing up from the creek. "Because those children haven't had a safe place to sleep or enough food to eat in longer than any child should have to endure. Because winter's coming fast, and we have nowhere else to go. And because—" he paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "Because I think you might need what I can offer as much as we need what you can provide. I've gotten along fine without help for 15 years. Have you?" He gestured toward her cabin, but his meaning seemed to encompass something larger. "This is a fine life you've built, Miss Garner, but it's a lonely one. When was the last time you heard children laughing? When did you last sit down to a meal with another adult?" His words stung because they held more truth than she wanted to acknowledge. "Loneliness was a choice I made, and maybe it was the right choice for a time. But choices can be changed." Before she could respond, Emma's voice called out from the direction of the creek. "Miss Garner, Papa! Come quick!" They hurried toward the sound, finding the children clustered around something at the water's edge. Thomas pointed excitedly at the creek bed, where a perfect arrowhead lay half buried in the sand. "Look what I found," he said, holding up the artifact with reverence. "It's from the Indians, isn't it?" Sylvie knelt beside him, examining the carefully knapped stone point. "Probably Ute," she said. "They hunted through this valley for generations before the white settlers came." "Can I keep it?" Thomas asked. "I suppose so. But remember, this was someone's tool once. Someone who lived on this land and knew it well." Daniel crouched down beside his son, and Sylvie watched as he carefully cleaned the dirt from the arrowhead. There was something gentle and patient in the way he handled both the artifact and his child's. Excitement that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "What does it mean when you find something like this?" Emma asked. "Maybe it means this is a special place," Thomas said solemnly. "A place where people have always come to make their homes." Sylvie glanced at Daniel and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Maybe it does," she said softly, as they walked back to the cabin together, the children running ahead with their treasure. Sylvie found herself torn between her deepening suspicion of Daniel's motives and her growing attachment to his children. Whatever secrets he carried, whatever had truly brought him to her mountain, she couldn't deny that his family's presence had already begun to change. Something essential about her carefully guarded world. The question was whether that change would prove to be a blessing, or the danger she'd spent 15 years trying to avoid. 3 days passed in a rhythm that began to feel almost natural. Daniel rose before dawn to work on the cabin improvements, his hammer blows echoing across the valley as the sun painted the mountain peaks gold and pink. Sylvie found herself looking forward to the sounds of his industry, the evidence that she was no longer entirely alone in her mountain sanctuary. Emma proved herself an eager student when Sylvie offered to teach her mountain skills. The girl had gentle hands and quick understanding as Sylvie showed her how to identify edible plants, how to read animal tracks in the soft earth, and most importantly, how to move quietly through the forest without disturbing the wildlife that could mean the difference between a successful hunt and going hungry. See how the deer path curves around this fallen log, Sylvie explained as they walked the familiar trail she used for checking her snares. Animals always choose the easiest route. If you learn to think like they do, you can predict where they'll go. Emma nodded seriously, her brown eyes bright with concentration. Mama used to say that understanding came from watching and listening more than talking. The mention of Daniel's wife caught Sylvie's attention. What was your mother like? She was beautiful, Emma said without hesitation. She had yellow hair and she sang while she cooked. Papa says I have her hands, good for delicate work. She held up her small hands, examining them as if seeing them anew. She taught me to embroider and make lace, but I think I like your mountain lessons better. Why's that? Emma considered the question with the seriousness of childhood. Because Mama's lessons were about making pretty things for other people to admire. Your lessons are about taking care of yourself. The wisdom in the child's words struck Sylvie deeply. She remembered her own mother's lessons, how to set a proper table, how to speak softly and keep one's opinions private, how to make oneself pleasing to others above all else. Those lessons had nearly destroyed her. Meanwhile, Thomas remained more reserved, staying close to his father's side as Daniel worked. But Sylvie noticed how the boy's eyes followed her movements when she thought he wasn't looking, and how he asked his father quiet questions about the techniques she was teaching Emma. On the morning of the 4th day, Daniel began work on what would become the frame for her new cabin. He'd selected trees from the forest edge with the eye of someone who understood wood grain and structural integrity. As Sylvie watched him work, she was struck by the precision of his movements, the way he seemed to envision the entire structure before placing each timber. It was while he was fitting a particularly large beam into place that she noticed the carved initials in the oak. Sem plus JB 1867. The sight hit her like a physical blow. She knew those initials, had traced them with her own finger 15 years ago, when she'd been a different person entirely. Sarah Millicent and James Blackwood, carved into the tree during their brief, doomed courtship. Where did this timber come from? She asked, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Daniel looked up from his work, following her gaze to the carved letters. Found it in a grove about 2 miles west of here. Tree had been struck by lightning, but the wood was still sound. I thought. He stopped, studying her face. Is something wrong? Sylvie forced herself to breathe steadily. Nothing. It's just old carving. Made me think of something. But as she walked away from the construction site, her mind raced back to memories she'd spent years trying to bury. She'd been Sarah Millicent then, 18 years old, and engaged to James Blackwood III, heir to a railroad fortune and everything she'd been raised to want. The courtship had been proper, supervised, and utterly suffocating. She remembered the day James had carved their initials, how he'd made it seem romantic, even as he detailed the life he'd planned for them. The house in Denver, where she'd host dinner parties. The children she'd raised to be proper society offspring. the charitable committees she'd joined to occupy her time. He'd spoken about her future as if she were a beautiful piece of furniture he was commissioning. That night, she'd lain awake in her father's house, staring at the ceiling and feeling like she was drowning. 3 days later, she'd disappeared in the middle of the night, taking only what she could carry and leaving behind everything she'd ever known. Miss Garner. Emma's voice brought her back to the present. "Are you all right? You look pale." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about something from a long time ago." "Sad thinking or happy thinking?" Sylvie looked down at the girl's concerned face and felt something shift in her chest. "Both, I suppose. Sometimes they're the same thing." That evening, as they shared another meal around her table, Daniel began to tell them about his wife's death. His voice was quiet and careful, mindful of his children's presence. But Sylvie heard the deep grief that still ran through him like an underground river. "Sarah took sick last spring," he said, "cutting meat for little Lucy. Started as a cough, but it got worse. The doctor did what he could, but—" He glanced at his children, choosing his words carefully. "She fought hard, but sometimes fighting isn't enough." "She told us to take care of Papa," Emma said softly. "Before she went to heaven, she made us promise." Thomas nodded solemnly. "She said Papa would be very sad, and we had to help him remember to eat and sleep." The simple faith in their voices brought tears to Sylvie's eyes. These children had lost their mother and their home, had spent weeks traveling through uncertainty and want, and yet they spoke of their responsibilities with the gravity of adults. "Your mama sounds like she was very wise," Sylvie said. "She was," Daniel agreed. "She always said that family was the only thing that really mattered in the end. Everything else, money, position, what other people thought, none of that would keep you warm at night or hold you when you cried." His words echoed strangely in Sylvie's mind, calling up memories of her own mother, who had valued social position above everything else, including her daughter's happiness. She'd been dead for 10 years now, and Sylvie couldn't remember a single conversation they'd had about what truly mattered. Later that night, as the children slept in the loft and Daniel dozed by the fire, Sylvie lay awake thinking about the carved initials in that oak beam. The coincidence felt too perfect, too pointed to be mere chance. But what did it mean? And how could Daniel have known to choose that particular tree? She thought about his questions regarding her safety and privacy, his interest in the layout of her property, the way his story about learning of her existence had been clearly false. Everything pointed to some deeper purpose behind his arrival. Yet when she watched him with his children, when she saw the genuine grief in his eyes as he spoke of his wife, she couldn't believe he meant her any real harm. Whatever game was being played, she sensed she was only seeing part of it. The question was whether she was willing to wait and see how it unfolded, or whether her hard-learned survival instincts should override her growing affection for this small, damaged family who had brought such unexpected warmth to her mountain home. On the 6th morning, Sylvie rose early to check her snares and found Daniel already awake, standing at the eastern edge of her property with what appeared to be a brass compass in his hands. He was studying the instrument with intense concentration, then looking out across the valley as if trying to orient himself to some specific landmark. She approached quietly, using the forest skills she'd taught Emma, but Daniel's hearing was sharp. He turned before she was within 20 feet, quickly pocketing the compass with movements that suggested guilt rather than mere surprise. "Morning, Miss Garner," he said, his voice carefully casual. "Beautiful sunrise today." "It is," she agreed, though she kept her attention on his face rather than the sky. "You're up early. Old habit. My father always said the best work gets done before most folks think to start their day." Sylvie nodded, but something about the compass nagged at her. She'd owned one herself for years, a practical tool for navigation in the wilderness, but Daniel had been studying his with the focus of someone searching for something specific. "Not simply getting his bearings. Find what you were looking for?" she asked directly. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Just checking my direction. Easy to get turned around in country like this, not if you've been here a week. The peaks are good landmarks once you learn them." "True enough." He started walking back toward the cabin, effectively ending the conversation, but Sylvie fell into step beside him. "Mr. Price, I've been thinking about our arrangement." He glanced at her, wariness creeping into his expression. Having second thoughts? Questions, more like. "You're clearly skilled at construction work, and I appreciate what you've done to improve the cabin. But I keep wondering why a man with your abilities would end up in such desperate circumstances." They'd reached the cabin yard now, where the frame of the new addition rose like the skeleton of some great beast. Daniel ran his hand along one of the support beams, checking its alignment with practiced ease. "Times are hard everywhere," he said finally. "Skills don't always translate to steady work. But you had a farm in Iowa. That's steady work if a man applies himself." Daniel's hand stilled on the timber. "Farm belonged to my wife's family. When she died, her father made it clear I wasn't welcome anymore. Said I hadn't taken proper care of his daughter, letting her work too hard, not getting the doctor soon enough when she took sick." The pain in his voice seemed genuine, but Sylvie had learned to distrust easy explanations. "So you just left, took the children and headed west with nothing? What choice did I have? Stay where I wasn't wanted, scraping by on handouts from people who blame me for Sarah's death?" He turned to face her fully. "I'd rather make an honest living somewhere else than beg from folks who've already decided I'm not worth their charity." There was pride in his words, the kind of fierce independence she recognized because she'd lived by it herself. But there were also gaps in his story, places where the details didn't quite align with the desperation she'd seen in him and his children that first night. "Papa," Emma's voice called from the cabin door. "Thomas won't eat his breakfast. He says his stomach hurts." Daniel's demeanor shifted instantly to that of a concerned father. "He probably just ate too fast yesterday. He's not used to having enough food." But when they went inside, Sylvie could see that Thomas was genuinely unwell. The boy's face was flushed with fever, and he complained of chills, despite the warmth from the fireplace. She felt his forehead with experienced hands, hot but not dangerously so. "Looks like he's coming down with something," she said. "Probably picked up a chill playing in the creek yesterday." Daniel's face went pale, with a fear that seemed disproportionate to a simple fever. "He can't be sick. Not now." The intensity of his reaction surprised her. "It's just a fever, Mr. Price. Children get them all the time." "You don't understand," he said, pulling Thomas onto his lap and wrapping him in a quilt. "After Sarah died, he was sick for weeks. Nearly lost him too. I can't—" His voice broke slightly. "I can't lose another one." Sylvie felt her suspicions soften in the face of such genuine terror. Whatever secrets Daniel might be keeping, his love for his children was absolutely real. "He'll be fine," she said firmly. "I have willow bark tea for the fever and honey to soothe his throat. We'll keep him warm and quiet today." As she prepared the medicinal tea, she found herself studying Daniel's reactions more closely. His fear seemed to go beyond normal parental concern into something approaching panic. She'd seen that kind of fear before, the desperate protectiveness of someone who'd already lost too much. Emma proved herself a capable assistant, helping to make Thomas comfortable and entertaining little Lucy while their father paced the cabin like a caged wolf. By midday, the willow bark had brought Thomas's fever down, and he was sleeping peacefully in the loft. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly as they stood watching over the boy. "I know I probably seemed terrified," Sylvie supplied. "Any parent would be, after what you've been through." He nodded gratefully, but she noticed that his hand kept moving to the pocket where he'd hidden the compass earlier. Whatever he'd been searching for that morning, it clearly weighed on him even now. That evening, with Thomas feeling better and the family gathered around the dinner table, Sylvie decided to test her growing suspicions. "I've been thinking," she said casually, "about expanding my herb garden next spring. There's a good spot down by the creek, but I'd need to clear some trees first." "I could help with that," Daniel offered immediately. "That's the spot where Thomas found the arrowhead," Emma added. "Maybe we'll find more Indian things." "Maybe so," Sylvie agreed. "Though I suspect this whole valley has quite a history. Probably changed hands many times over the years." She watched Daniel's face carefully as she spoke, but his expression remained neutral. Most places do, I suppose. People come and go, leaving their marks. Some marks are deeper than others, Sylvie said, thinking of the carved initials that were now part of her cabin's frame. Some leave traces that last for generations. This time, she caught a flicker of something in Daniel's eyes. Recognition. Concern before he looked away. More coffee? She offered, rising from the table. As she poured, she found herself more convinced than ever that Daniel Price had come to her mountain for reasons that went far beyond simple survival. The question was whether those reasons threatened her carefully built sanctuary, or whether they might somehow be connected to the past she'd spent 15 years trying to escape. The discovery came by accident on the 10th day of their stay. Sylvie had gone to the barn to fetch more nails for Daniel's work when she noticed his leather satchel had fallen open, spilling some of its contents across the hay-covered floor. As she bent to help gather the scattered tools, her fingers closed around something that wasn't a hammer or chisel. It was a folded document, yellowed with age and bearing an official seal. Even upside down and partially folded, she could make out the words land, patent and territory of Colorado. Her heart stopped as she recognized the familiar script of a legal document, the kind she'd hoped never to see again. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper completely. The deed was dated 1867, granting ownership of 640 acres in the Colorado Territory to one James Blackwood III, the boundaries of which perfectly described the land where she'd built her life for the past 15 years. The world seemed to tilt sideways as the implications crashed over her. The land wasn't hers, had never been hers. For 15 years, she'd been nothing more than a squatter on property that legally belonged to the man she'd fled from in the middle of the night. Miss Garner. She spun around to find Daniel standing in the barn doorway, his face grave. He'd obviously seen what she held in her hands. "I can explain," he said quietly. "Can you?" Her voice came out harsher than she'd intended, edged with 15 years of carefully suppressed panic. "Because right now, it looks like you've been lying to me from the moment you arrived." Daniel stepped into the barn, closing the door behind him. "Not lying. Just not telling you everything? There's a difference?" "Yes, there is." He moved closer, his hands held open and empty in a gesture of peace. "My name is Daniel Price. Those are my children. My wife did die last spring, and we have been traveling for weeks looking for work. But that's not why you're here." "No," he admitted. "That's not why I'm here." Sylvie folded the deed carefully, her mind racing through possibilities, each worse than the last. "Who sent you?"
"James Blackwood."
Daniel's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You know about James Blackwood?" "Answer my question." "His son, James Blackwood IV. He hired me to find you and convince you to leave the land." The barn felt suddenly airless. James had a son. Of course he did. 15 years was long enough for him to marry someone else, to build the family he'd planned to build with her. And now that family wanted her gone. "How did he find me?" she whispered. "Took him years. He hired investigators, but you'd covered your tracks well. It was only when he started looking into unsettled territorial claims that he found evidence of someone living on his father's land." Sylvie sank down onto a hay bale, the weight of discovery settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. "So you came to evict me? I came to make you an offer." "What kind of offer?" Daniel pulled a second document from his coat pocket, this one newer, bearing a lawyer's letterhead. "The Blackwood family is prepared to pay you a substantial sum to relocate quietly. Enough money to buy good land somewhere else, start over with more resources than you have now." She looked at the paper but didn't take it. "And if I refuse, then they'll pursue legal eviction. It would take time, but the courts would side with the legal landowner eventually." The careful way he spoke told her there was more to it than simple legal proceedings. "What aren't you telling me?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice held a new weight. "James Blackwood IV isn't just interested in the land. He's interested in you." Cold dread settled in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "He knows who you are. Sarah Millicent Ashford, daughter of Judge Ashford of Denver." The woman who was engaged to his father and disappeared without explanation in 1867. 15 years of carefully constructed anonymity crumbled in an instant. She'd known this day might come, but knowing and experiencing were vastly different things. "He wants to meet with you," Daniel continued, "to discuss what happened, why you left. He says his father never stopped wondering, never stopped. His father is dead. The question escaped before she could stop it, 5 years ago. But he talked about you, apparently. About the engagement that ended so suddenly." Sylvie stood abruptly, pacing to the barn window that looked out over the valley she'd come to think of as home. "What did you tell the son about me?" "Nothing yet. I was supposed to observe you, confirm your identity, and report back before making any approach. And have you?" "Confirmed my identity?" Daniel's reflection appeared beside hers in the dusty glass. "You knew those initials in the oak beam. You reacted to the name Blackwood. You've got the education and bearing of someone who grew up with privilege, despite 15 years of mountain living." She turned to face him directly. "So what happens now?" "You send word that you found me, and James Blackwood IV comes to collect his father's wayward bride. It doesn't have to be that way, doesn't it? You just told me I'm living on his land illegally, that he has legal grounds to evict me. The offer is real, Sylvie. The money would give you choices." The sound of her real name on his lips was like a physical blow. For 15 years, she'd been Sylvie Garner, mountain woman, beholden to no one. Sarah Millicent Ashford had been buried so deep, she'd almost convinced herself that girl had never existed. "How much?" she asked, hating herself for the question. "Enough to buy 1,000 acres of good farmland anywhere in the country. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life." It was more money than she could have imagined. More than enough to disappear again, to build another life somewhere else. But the thought of running again, of abandoning everything she'd built here, made her feel sick. "And your payment for finding me?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Enough to buy land of my own, to give my children the security they deserve. So we're both bought and paid for. It's not like that, isn't it?" She gestured around the barn, taking in the tools, the evidence of his skilled work, the life she'd allowed him and his children to build here. "You came here to spy on me. Everything, the hungry children, the desperate father, the skilled carpenter who just happened to need work, all of it was a lie. The children's hunger was real," Daniel said fiercely. "My desperation was real. The work I've done for you, that's real too. But the foundation of it all was deception." He couldn't argue with that. And his silence was answer enough. Outside the barn, she could hear Emma and Thomas playing, their laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. In a few hours, they'd gather round her table again, sharing food and conversation like the family they'd begun to feel like. But now she knew it was all built on lies, and the knowledge poisoned everything that had grown between them. That evening, the tension around the dinner table was thick enough to cut with a knife. The children sensed something had changed between the adults, but couldn't understand what. Emma kept glancing between Sylvie and her father with worried eyes, while Thomas ate his stew in unusual silence. "Are we in trouble, Papa?" Emma finally asked, her voice small. Daniel looked across the table at Sylvie, a silent plea in his eyes. "Why would you think that, sweetheart? You and Miss Garner keep looking at each other like grown-ups do when they're angry, but don't want children to know." The perceptiveness of the observation struck Sylvie with unexpected force. These children had already endured the loss of their mother and their home. They didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of whatever game the adults were playing. "Miss Garner and I just have some things to discuss," Daniel said carefully. "It's nothing for you to worry about." But Emma was too intelligent to be placated by vague reassurances. "Are we going to have to leave? Because if we do, I want you to know this has been the best place we've lived since Mama died." The simple honesty of the statement made Sylvie's chest tighten. She looked at little Lucy, contentedly playing with a piece of bread, and at Thomas, who had finally started to lose some of the wariness that had shadowed his young face. Whatever Daniel's deceptions, these children had found something here they desperately needed. "I don't know what's going to happen," Sylvie said honestly. There are some complications that your father and I need to work through. After the children were settled in the loft for the night, Sylvie and Daniel sat by the fire in heavy silence. Finally, she spoke without looking at him. "Tell me about James Blackwood IV. What kind of man is he?" Daniel stared into the flames before answering. "Different from what I expected. Younger, maybe 35. Educated, well-spoken. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding what happened between you and his father. Interested or obsessed? Maybe both." Daniel shifted in his chair. "He's never married, according to what I heard in Denver. Some say he's been too focused on business to settle down, or too focused on his father's unfinished business. Maybe so. But Sylvie..." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "When he talked about you, it wasn't with anger or resentment. He seemed sad more than anything else, like he was carrying some burden that belonged to his father." Sylvie pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "What exactly did he tell you about the engagement?" "That it ended suddenly in 1867, that you disappeared without explanation, leaving behind all your belongings and your family, that his father spent years looking for you, hiring investigators, following every lead. And what did James think happened to me?" Daniel hesitated. He feared the worst, that you'd been abducted or had taken your own life. He never stopped believing you were in danger somewhere, needing help he couldn't provide. The image Daniel painted was so different from the reality Sylvie remembered that it left her speechless. The James Blackwood she'd fled from had been controlling and suffocating, more interested in possessing her than understanding her. The idea that he'd spent years worried about her safety seemed impossible. "He was wrong," she said finally. "About what?" "About me needing help. I saved myself. From what?" The question hung in the air between them. Sylvie had never told anyone the full truth about why she'd fled Denver, and the habit of secrecy was hard to break from a life that would have killed everything I was, she said at last. "James had my entire future planned out, where I'd live, what I'd do, how I'd spend my days. He spoke about our marriage like I was a problem he'd solved, rather than a person he loved. Maybe he just didn't know how to express his feelings differently. Or maybe he didn't have feelings to express. Maybe I was just another acquisition to him, like his railroad stocks or his mining interests." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "What would it take for you to consider meeting with his son?" "Nothing. There's nothing he could offer that would make me want to relive that part of my life. Not even if it meant securing a real future for those children upstairs." The question hit its target with devastating accuracy. Sylvie looked toward the loft, where she could hear the soft sounds of the children settling into sleep, sounds that had become dear to her over the past 10 days. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't use them as leverage against me. They're innocent in all this. They are innocent, and they deserve more than a life of constant uncertainty and want. They deserve a father who doesn't lie to them about why they're constantly moving from place to place." Daniel flinched as if she'd struck him. "I've never lied to my children. Haven't you? Have you told them you came here to spy on a woman for money? Have you explained that their safety and comfort depend on your ability to betray someone who's shown them kindness? It's not that simple, isn't it?" Sylvie stood and moved to the window, looking out at the half-completed cabin addition that represented so much more than mere construction. "You accepted money to find me and convinced me to leave my home. Everything else, the hungry children, the skilled carpentry, the grateful father, that's all just the method you chose to accomplish your real mission." "The children's hunger was real," Daniel said again, more quietly this time. "My desperation was real. And what I felt growing between us these past days, that's real too." Sylvie turned to face him, and in the firelight she could see the genuine pain in his expression. "What you felt? Don't pretend you haven't felt it too. The ease of sharing meals and conversation, the way Emma lights up when you teach her something new, the way Thomas has started to trust again. Even little Lucy laughs more now than she has since her mother died. He was right, and that made everything worse." She had felt it, the gradual softening of her solitary life, the unexpected joy of having children's voices fill her cabin. The comfort of adult companionship after years of talking only to herself and the mountains. None of that changes what you are, she said. Or why you're here. Maybe not. But it changes what I want. What you want doesn't matter. You've made your bargain, and now you have to live with it. Daniel stood and moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the silver threads in his dark hair, the lines that grief and hard living had carved around his eyes. I could tell him I never found you, he said quietly. I could take my children and disappear, let James Blackwood IV believe his search was unsuccessful, and live as fugitives, always looking over your shoulders, never staying anywhere long enough to build a real life. If that's what it takes to protect you. The offer was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she thought she knew about his motivations, that it left her momentarily speechless. The next morning brought an early snowfall that dusted the mountain peaks with white, and reminded Sylvie that winter was approaching faster than she'd anticipated. She'd spent the night wrestling with Daniel's offer to abandon his mission, weighing it against her growing attachment to his family and her fear of what James Blackwood IV might want from her. She was preparing breakfast when Daniel appeared at her elbow, his face grave and his hands shaking slightly as he held out a folded piece of paper. There's something else, he said quietly. Something I should have told you yesterday, but I wasn't sure how to say it. Sylvie looked at the paper suspiciously. Another deed? More legal documents proving I don't belong here? No, this is personal. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. It's a letter my wife wrote before she died. She made me promise to give it to you if I ever found you. The words made no sense. Your wife knew me? Read it, he said, pressing the letter into her hands. Please. Sylvie unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The handwriting was feminine but weak, as if written by someone with little strength left. The date at the top was from the previous spring, just weeks before Daniel said his wife had died. My dearest sister, if Daniel is reading this to you, then two things have happened. I have passed from this world, and he has finally found you after all these years of searching. I pray that both events bring some measure of peace to hearts that have carried too much sorrow. Sylvie's legs gave out, and she sank into the nearest chair. Sister, the letter was addressed to her as sister. I know you must be confused, dear Sylvie. You knew me as Sarah, your younger sister, though I have been Sarah Price for 8 years now. When you disappeared that night in 1867, our parents were devastated. They searched for you everywhere, hired investigators, followed every lead. But I knew something they didn't. I had read your diary, seen your desperate plans to escape the life they had chosen for you. I was only 16 then, too young to fully understand your courage in choosing freedom over security. But as the years passed and you remained missing, I began to comprehend what you had done and why. You had saved yourself from a prison made of silk and good intentions. The letter blurred as tears filled Sylvie's eyes. She looked up to find Daniel watching her with compassion and something that might have been relief. Sarah Ashford, she whispered. My little sister, Sarah. She kept her maiden name as her middle name when we married, Daniel said softly. Sarah Ashford Price. She never stopped hoping she'd find you someday. Sylvie returned to the letter with shaking hands. Our parents died within 2 years of each other, both of broken hearts, I believe. Father never recovered from losing you, and Mother couldn't bear the shame of what the society papers said about your disappearance. They left everything to me, but I would have traded it all for one more day with my sister. I moved to Iowa after their funeral, trying to start fresh somewhere no one knew our family's tragedy. That's where I met Daniel, my dear, gentle Daniel, who has given me more happiness than I ever dared hope for. We have 3 beautiful children together, Emma, Thomas, and little Lucy. They are your niece and nephews, though they don't know they have an aunt who lives in the mountains. Sylvie's heart stopped. Emma, Thomas, and Lucy, the children she'd grown to love over the past 10 days, were her blood relatives. Her sister's children. I'm dying, Sylvie. The consumption that took our grandmother has found me too. The doctors say I have weeks, perhaps days. But before I leave this world, I need to know that my children will be cared for, not just by their father, but by family. I have made Daniel promise to find you. I've told him everything I could remember about your last days in Denver, about the engagement that terrified you, about the night you vanished. I've given him the tools he needs to locate you, and I've made him swear that he will bring our children to meet their aunt. If you are reading this, he has kept his promise. The letter continued, but Sylvie had to stop reading as sobs overwhelmed her. 15 years of believing herself completely alone in the world, only to discover that her sister had been alive, married, raising a family, and now was gone forever. Just when Sylvie might have found her again, Daniel knelt beside her chair, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. She talked about you constantly, especially near the end. She said you were the bravest person she'd ever known, choosing your own path, even when it meant losing everything else. I lost her, Sylvie managed through her tears. I lost my little sister, but you have her children. We have her children. Sylvie looked up at him through her tears, suddenly understanding the deeper currents that had been running beneath their conversations. The Blackwood land deed. That wasn't why you came looking for me. No. Sarah had heard rumors over the years about a woman living alone in the Colorado mountains, someone who matched your description. She hired an investigator of her own, found out about the territorial claim, about someone living on what used to be Blackwood land. That's how I knew where to look. But the money from James Blackwood is real. When I went to Denver to prepare for the search, I let it be known I was looking for information about Sarah Millicent Ashford. Word reached the Blackwood family and young James contacted me. The job he offered was convenient. It gave me the resources I needed to search properly and provided a cover story for why I was in the mountains. Sylvie wiped her eyes and returned to the letter. I don't know what your life has become in these 15 years, dear sister. I hope you have found peace in your mountain sanctuary. But I am asking you to consider taking on one more responsibility, helping Daniel raise our children. They need more than one parent, more than just their father's love, no matter how deep that love runs. Emma is 8 now, with your quick mind and independent spirit. Thomas is 6, gentle like his father, but with our family's stubborn streak. Little Lucy is only 2, but she has Sarah grandmother's eyes and already shows signs of the curiosity that marked all the Ashford women. They are good children, raised with love and respect for others. They deserve to know about their mother's family, about the aunt who chose courage over comfort. Most of all, they deserve to grow up surrounded by people who will love them unconditionally. I know this is an enormous request. You built your solitary life for good reasons, and I have no right to ask you to change it for the sake of children you've never met. But if you could find it in your heart to let them into your world, not as strangers seeking charity, but as family coming home, it would mean everything to me. Your loving sister always. Sarah Ashford Price P.S. Daniel is a good man, Sylvie, though he may not believe it himself. He blames himself for my death, thinks he should have gotten the doctor sooner, should have protected me better. But the truth is simpler. Sometimes love isn't enough to hold back death. He needs to forgive himself, and he needs someone to help him see that life doesn't end just because love does. I think you might be the person to show him that. Sylvie folded the letter carefully, her hands steadier now despite the emotional storm raging in her chest. Above them, she could hear the children stirring in the loft, preparing for another day that would now be fundamentally different from all the days that had come before. They're my family, she said quietly. They're our family. Daniel corrected gently. She looked at him with new eyes, seeing not the deceptive stranger who had arrived at her door, but the man her sister had loved. The father who had kept a dying woman's promise even when it meant deceiving someone he'd come to care about. Sarah asked you to find me for the children's sake. She did. But she also said something else near the very end. What? Daniel's eyes met hers directly. She said that if I was very lucky, I might find that I needed you as much as the children did. The revelation that Emma, Thomas, and Lucy were her sister's children changed everything and nothing. Sylvie still faced the same impossible choice: stay and risk confrontation with James Blackwood IV, or flee and abandon the family she'd just discovered. But now the stakes felt infinitely higher. For 3 days after Daniel shared Sarah's letter, they existed in a strange suspension of time. The children, sensing the adult's emotional turmoil but not understanding its source, became more clingy and watchful. Emma asked pointed questions about why Sylvie and her father kept having quiet conversations that stopped when the children appeared. Thomas retreated into the silence that seemed to be his way of processing uncertainty, while little Lucy fussed more than usual, as if picking up on the tension around her. Daniel continued work on the cabin addition, but his movements had lost their earlier confidence. He would start a task, then stand staring at his hands as if he'd forgotten what he was supposed to be doing. More than once, Sylvie caught him watching her with an expression of desperate hope mixed with guilt. On the 4th morning, everything changed. Sylvie was teaching Emma to weave grass baskets when the sound of multiple horses echoing up the valley path made them both freeze. Visitors to her remote cabin were rare enough that a single rider would have been cause for alarm. Multiple horses suggested something much worse. "Papa," Emma called, her voice tight with fear. Daniel emerged from behind the cabin where he'd been reinforcing the foundation, his face grim as he counted the approaching riders. "Get inside," he ordered quietly. "All of you now," but it was too late for concealment. 5 men on horseback rounded the bend in the trail, led by a figure that made Sylvie's blood turn to ice in her veins. Even at a distance, even after 15 years, she recognized the bearing and the cut of expensive clothes that marked James Blackwood IV. He was younger than she'd expected. Perhaps 35, as Daniel had said, with dark hair and the kind of refined features that spoke of generations of good breeding. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, pale blue, almost grey, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The riders arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around the cabin yard, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold morning air. The 4 men accompanying young Blackwood had the look of hired guns rather than simple ranch hands, hard faces, alert postures, and the kind of casual confidence that came from being comfortable with violence. "Miss Sarah Millicent Ashford," James Blackwood IV said, dismounting with fluid grace. "Or do you prefer Miss Garner now?" His voice was cultured, educated, but underneath the politeness lay something that reminded Sylvie uncomfortably of his father. The same assumption that he had the right to whatever he wanted, the same inability to see other people as anything more than obstacles to his desires. "My name is Sylvie Garner," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "You're trespassing on my property." James smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Actually, Miss Ashford, you're trespassing on mine. This land has belonged to the Blackwood family since 1867. I have the deed to prove it." Daniel moved closer to Sylvie, his hand resting casually on the handle of his hammer. "Mr. Blackwood, we agreed that any meeting would be arranged beforehand, conducted in town with proper witnesses present. Plans change. Mr. Price." James's attention shifted to Daniel with obvious displeasure. "I'm disappointed in your lack of progress. 3 weeks, and still no agreement from Miss Ashford to accept our generous offer. 3 weeks. Sylvie looked between the 2 men with growing understanding. "You've been reporting to him this whole time?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's not what you think, isn't it?" James interrupted. "Mr. Price has been keeping me informed of your activities, Miss Ashford. Your daily routines, your emotional state, your growing attachment to his charming family. All very useful information for determining how best to approach you." The casual cruelty in his words hit Sylvie like a physical blow. Every moment of the past weeks, every shared meal, every conversation, every growing feeling of connection had been observed, analyzed, and reported like data in some elaborate game. "That's enough," Daniel said, his voice carrying a warning. "Is it?" James pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Because I have a signed contract here, Mr. Price, specifying the terms of your employment. Terms that include a substantial bonus for successful completion of your